Everybody thinks they're in charge of their own actions. Who else? Well, good evening, and thank you for coming. It's my second trip to Seoul, and it's wonderful to be here. Tonight, we want to talk about a question that we're all interested in. Who's in charge, you or your brain? And what is the implication of figuring that out for how we may want to run our legal system and how we may want to think about punishment for those people who violate our social norms. Now, everybody thinks they're in charge of their own actions. Who else? When you move your hand, you think it's you moving it. You don't think it's Santa Claus. Right? It's a powerful, powerful belief we have. And the question is it an illusion? Now, illusions are powerful things. We experience them all the time. And then we can even know it's an illusion. We can understand why it's an illusion. But we still believe it's what it is, what we see. It doesn't violate our thought about the nature of it. So take this classic visual illusion. You see those two tables sitting there. This is the famous illusion by Roger Shepard. And you would swear the one on the right is a shorter, wider table than the one on the left. And the actual fact of the matter is that they're the exact same. Of the activities of your brain go on, and you don't know anything about them either. You don't know how you touched your nose if you touch your nose. You don't know what the brain just did to do all of that. So most of the things that go on are unconscious. They're out of our conscious awareness. They're automatic as far as we're concerned. They go on their own game plan. And in that setting, we want to know what we mean by free will. So the philosophers look at this question and they give some definitions. Free will, the belief that human behavior is an expression of personal choice and is not determined by physical forces, fate, or God. There is a you, a self, a person calling the shots, a command center in your brain. Humans possess a special freedom suspended from causation. You are doing it. There's a little person in there, in fact, doing it, pulling all the levers that make us function and make our hands and move and walk and so forth, and thoughts. We are doing it. There's this illusion that the big we is in there making it all happen.
Look at this.
What the hell is that?
Well, you get the idea. There's a little, Hollywood has to teach us this fundamental point that's been argued for 2,000 years. Who's in charge? And there's a little person in there that's in charge, right? And that's you. And modern scientists think that we're going in the direction of more sophisticated robots, which are things we make, and somehow there's going to be some magic circuit that's added to the programs that run these robots, and that magic circuit will add to us or give that robot maybe free will. We can do anything, is the thought. So we come to the question, do we have free will? And I'm going to start with my argument to ask the question, free from what? What do we want to be free from? And I'm going to argue it's not a useful concept, that brains work in a mechanistic way, that brains do enable minds, and that you, that thing that you think is doing everything, is your vastly parallel and distributed brain. Brains are automatic, and yet, I want to argue, you are responsible. Now, how do you put those two things together? Now, this idea is a big idea, big issues. Cultures struggle with it. Humans have struggled with it. And as I like to say, and others before me, ideas have consequences. So a couple years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in Rome, the Pope's Science Division, held a meeting where the ideas of question, where did this determinism come from, and what is its significance for understanding personal responsibility? It's a very important question to them, and they brought together a series of brain scientists from all over the world to ponder it. So what I want to do is go through the ideas of determinism and how we are to think about it and its relationship to law and so forth. So if we go back to Lucretius, he was taken with this idea of determinism as well. And he wrote, again, this is thinking of, over 2,000 years ago. These people didn't even have Google. And he thought, again, if all movement is interconnected, the new arising from the old in a deterministic order, if the atoms never swerve so as to originate some new movement that will snap the bonds of fate, what is the source of the free will possessed by living things throughout the earth? Well, Lucretius' answer to it was, the atoms do swerve. So even though he sort of thought through the implications of a determined world, his solution to the issue was to claim that atoms do swerve and therefore freedom was with us. But in the ensuing 2,000 years, from Copernicus to Newton to Darwin to Einstein to modern neuroscience, there's been this march towards the notion of a deterministic, mechanistic brain. And that's where I would say the vast majority of scientists today hold some form of this view. Einstein put it, I do not believe in free will. This awareness of the lack of free will keeps me from taking myself and my fellow man too seriously as acting and deciding individuals and from losing my temper. So he didn't believe in it. And Francis Crick, discoverer of DNA, your joys and your sorrows, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the outpouring of behaviors of your brain, is basically what he's saying. So the major scientists of the last century adopted this view, and and sincerely hold the view. There was a little bit of a flurry in the 30s when Niels Bohr and Werner von Heisenberg came up with a quantum physical theory of the nature of matter, where we thought in terms of probabilities, no longer in terms of certainties. And they maintained that, okay, there's got to be wiggle room in there, and therefore one could use that to think that there is freedom of some kind. But by and large, that view didn't seem to be worth thinking about. It was the wrong, as people like to say, it's the wrong level of analysis for thinking about how the American Korean neuroscientist, the brilliant Sebastian Sung, put it very cleverly to me. He's both a neuroscientist, physicist, philosopher, he's everything. He's now at Princeton University. Our folk understanding, our psychological understanding of people is where the action is. He says, take a football player, put a meal in front of him, and ask the question, is he going to eat it? A hungry football player, is he going to eat that hamburger and French fries there? And the answer instantly from everybody in this auditorium and in the world would be yes. He says, well, now let's take a quantum description of that guy and figure out from the quantum data if he's going to eat that hamburger. He said it would take 1 million computers 10 million years to figure that out. It's the wrong level of analysis. And I think he's right. When it comes to the law, the question is, well, mechanistic approaches may be scientifically valid, but is it legally relevant? And there's the view of determinism, there's no free will, and that's represented by the gentleman on your left, Joshua Green at Harvard University, and the distinguished jurist Stephen Morse at the University of Pennsylvania says, no, it's not relevant knowing all that stuff because people think in what is called folk psychology. So is neuroscience relevant to the law? I think the question is not bad brains or good brains. Acts and mental states, folk psychology explains the behavior we're going to see in the courtroom. So neuroscience is the wrong level of analysis for determining responsibility. The level of analysis is the social rule between people. Brains are automatic. Analysis of brains cannot illuminate the capacity for responsibility, a dimension that comes only from social exchange. So responsibility, I like to say, is in the social layer. All right, so that's where we're going. That's the overall arch of the talk. I want to take you through now where this all came from. That's all very a summary, but where did these ideas progress from? And I'm going to give you what I like to call at least the North American perspective. It comes from a fascinating history of American psychology and neuroscience. This is a picture taken in 1948 of two very famous psychologists, Carl Lashley on the left and Donald Hebb on the right. Carl Lashley is the father of physiological psychology as we now know it, and Donald Hebb is the father of neuropsychology, a Canadian, and famous for his theory of the synapse. And I would give anything to know what they were actually talking about in this picture, but their views are representative of some of the great issues on this question. So the North American, is the brain a blank slate and largely plastic, or does the brain come with constraints and somewhat determined by its structure? These were the questions those two fought about and discussed and studied for over 50 years. Lashley believed the brain basically was made up of putty and you could shape it to become anything you wanted. His key principles that was mass action in the brain, that it was how much brain you had in what area that predicted its capacity to function. And so there was what he called equipotentiality throughout the cortex. Any part of the cortex with the right instructions and experience could become anything. And that went beautifully with the father of behaviorism, John B. Watson, who suggested that this famous line, give me any baby and I'll turn him into anything, is what he said. And Americans, that's kind of the American dream. Anything goes. We can take anybody and turn them into anything because if we order the stimulus and the responses and the rewards in the appropriate manner. And so these people worked hand in hand, and their brain theory, their brain knowledge at the time purportedly supported their psychological theory. There was a very famous neurobiologist in Chicago by the name of Paul Weiss who seconded that. He was all part of the support for this idea. And he came up with the notion that function precedes form. And that is, the neurons, for example, the neurons that grow out to your arm and your hand grew out there just at random. But then as the hand began to be used as a hand and the arm was used as an arm, that function stamped on the nerves the specificity. Function precedes form was the notion. So all of these were very large on the environment affecting how the brain got built. Then along came Roger Sperry. And Roger Sperry was my professor, my teacher many years ago. And wound up getting the Nobel Prize, not for this work, but for other work we'll mention later on. A brilliant man, and he just said, that's crazy. That's not how it works. And Roger Sperry spent a good part of his life showing that there's something called neurospecificity, that the brain wires up in a very specific way. The genetic control of the growth and development of our brain is enormous. Not complete, but enormous. And he did things, very clever experiments. He did things like taking frogs' eyes and twisting them upside down. So what was up was down and what was down is up. And then he would dangle flies in front of the frog and see if the frog could learn to switch where its tongue went to try to get the fly. And the frogs couldn't learn, even if the surgery was done early. So it seemed like what the frog's eye tells the frog brain was stamped in early and was specific, and it couldn't be changed by experience. And he did similar studies in the growth of the neurons from the retina to the midbrain of the fish, showing the great specificity. One part of the eye always grew to a particular part of the brain. And if you stuck the nerve in a foreign part of the brain, the nerves would find their way back to the part that the genetic map had determined. So with Sperry's work, there was a shakeup in the notion of how the brain is built. There was a belief that there was great neurospecificity, and there were apparently a lot of determined structures in the brain. Well, what about, let's raise this to psychological responses and questions that we come with as humans. What comes, as we say, from the factory and the babies that we all make. And one finding, to great surprise, comes from the work of Renée Balgeron at the University of Illinois. Does brilliant work. And she shows the number of things with respect to justice, of our thoughts about fairness, seem to be built in. So here's what Renée does. She has a baby, let's call baby B, or baby A hits baby B, all right? So she has her little babies there watching this little play going on. And so baby A hits baby B, and then baby B hits baby A back. Bam, right? What about the babies watching it? They're not surprised. You know, that's just the way the world is, right? So then she does another test. Baby A goes over and hinders baby B. Baby's surprised if C, after that, goes over and helps baby A. Wait a minute. You're in the group that just got hit by this person. How can you go help them? That doesn't seem to be a good thing. The baby acts surprised. That's violating something. She shows all kinds of tests where these basic instincts seem to be just there. Well, they are by definition if it's an instinct, but these basic behaviors seem to be just there. So it looks like in Renée's work, there's dozens, hundreds of these examples by now of some things that seem to be built in and some things that are not. There's some structure in the brain that exists. And so we're going to call those, for purposes now, modules, specific little subsystems that are in the brain. And people take this and can study it in many ways. Even economists study this stuff. And they use something called the ultimatum game to study it. And the ultimatum game is a simple game. You have two people, and you give one of them $20. And they have to share the money. The guy that gets the $20 has to give some of it away to the second person. So the second, and then the game's over. One trial, that's it. How much is the other guy going to take? Well, the other guy should say yes to anything, right? Because he has nothing to begin with. And if the guy gives him $1 or $5 or $10, he's ahead. He's good. But here's what they discovered. The guy with $20 says to the guy that doesn't have any, I'll give you $1. Rationally, that person should accept it because he's at least got $1. Game's over after that. But what they discovered is there's this fairness deal. And the person who has to answer yes or no, they discovered that the person has to get up to $5 or $6 before he'll say, yes, I'll take the money. He won't take the $1. That's just not fair. Even though he at least gets $1 out of the deal. So there's this fairness module. And through a series of studies, they decided it's in a special part of the brain, the right prefrontal areas. So what they cleverly do is they put more subjects in this experiment. And they use a little brain trick of something called the magnetic, transmagnetic stimulation. And they zap that part of the brain before the judgment. They hit it, as they were. They kind of stun it. They kind of anesthetize it. And then they ask for the fairness judgment. and the fairness judgment completely changes, and they raise the amount they will say before they accept. So there's this modular view. It's studied in many ways, studied in dynamic situations like this, and it's also studied clinically. This is one of the hallmark findings of a neuropsychology, which is that focal lesions in various regions do specific things. And the reason to present this is to make clear how the brain seems to be organized. It's organized in these modules, okay? So I'm going to show you some clinical examples. You're going to get a case of a patient here who has a right parietal lesion, has a disorder called, doesn't matter what it's called reduplicative paramnesia. That's a mouthful. There's no way that translates. But it's a person who doesn't believe they are where they are, they believe they're somewhere else, even though on every other dimension they're perfectly rational and informed. They just happen to think, in this particular case, this woman thinks she's in her house in the state of Maine, when in fact she's at a New York hospital, right? Strange, right? It comes to life when a lesion occurs in a particular part of the brain. And here she is being interviewed, and you get to see it for yourself.
Where are you?
She was?
Right now, I'm in Jonesport, Maine, in my house on Island Street.
Are you going to have an operation in your house?
I hope not.
Where are you going to have the operation?
In Sloan Kettering, New York, I hope, with some experts, I hope.
But you're not there now.
No. But when I get there, you can ask me and I'll tell you.
Okay.
So a little lesion in the right hemisphere produces this unique and strange state of someone in their mind being displaced in space to another place. Now, this part of the brain, by the way, has become very well studied recently. It's also part of the brain that seems to be disrupted when people have out-of-body experiences. It puts them, these people who say there's somebody up above them looking down at them and that kind of thing. So it's very important in placing people in space, and you can see the disorder. Another one, of course, that we're all more familiar with is when a stroke occurs to the part of the brain that disrupts understanding of language. This is called Wernicke's aphasia, and the people involved have a very definite disorder. I'll give you an example of it, where they can't seem to understand or produce coherent language. This modular brain, though, has something interesting. It's got all these little areas that are specialized for particular things, but it also seems integrated in a way, and it has a wonderful feature called the interpretive capacity. And this was discovered by studying patients who have their hemispheres divided in an effort to control their epilepsy. And the notion is, if you cut that connection you see there in the second picture, if you cut that connection, if a seizure starts in one brain, it will not spread over to the other half brain. And so because that's the case, the thought was that maybe the patient would not go into a generalized convulsion. So that gave rise to allow people to study what the left brain and the right brain do when they're separated. And it gave rise to a discovery of something called the interpreter. And this interpreter is important because, among other things, it may explain why you and I think we are in charge. Because this interpreter, turns out, makes up stories to explain why we do the things we do. So think about it. What you see there is a picture of a split brain patient looking at a picture of a snow scene and a chicken claw. Now, if I ask you to look at that picture, you would say, I ask you, what do you see? You would say, well, I see a snow scene and a chicken claw. No, what's the problem here? If I ask a split brain patient to see that, to look at that and see that, they would simply say, I saw a chicken claw, that's all. Now, why is that? Well, the normal person with the intact brain would look at that, and the snow scene goes to the right brain, and it gets transferred over to the left speaking hemisphere. The chicken claw goes directly to the left hemisphere, and so the patient just says, I saw a chicken claw. The brain's hooked up together. The speech center on the left can describe everything. But now you take a split brain person and show them the same picture, and instead of asking them what they see, you just ask them to point to the correct answer. So the patient sees the chicken, that is, the left hemisphere sees the chicken claw, and the right hand, and it can direct the right hand to the picture of the chicken. And the left hand sees, points to the shovel because the right brain saw a snow scene. So the patient's sitting there answering the questions. The chicken claw goes with the chicken with the right hand. The shovel goes to with the snow scene with the left hand. And now we're going to ask the patient, well, why did you do that? Why did you point to those things? And the patient instantly says, oh, well, that's easy. The chicken claw goes with the chicken because that's all the information that went to the left speaking hemisphere. And the left speaking hemisphere really doesn't know why the left hand is pointing to that shovel, right? Because that was presented to the right brain. But he instantly says, oh, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. It has to make up a story to make his behavior coherent with what is ongoing in his cognitive state at that moment. And that's what you and I do all the time. We're constantly making up a story to keep our narrative going about moods we're in, about actions we take, all that stuff. The split brain subject simply allowed us to see it and to examine it in a scientific setting. We are the storytelling animal. These stories are becoming important, and the one we tell about ourselves, that we are making these decisions, is, I think, another one. So here we are. We have no problem believing clocks are automatic. We have no problem. No one thinks cells are automatic. All the billions of cells in your body. We want them to be automatic. You know, we're counting on them to be automatic. But for some reason, when we suggest the brain is automatic, people are very unhappy with that. But I maintain, that's not so bleak. I mean, think about it. Don't you want your brain to work, right? Let's say I want to pick up this bottle of water. I don't want my hand to go over there. I want everything to work. So the mechanisms responsible for such an act come forth and do their job. So the brain is automatic, but I maintain that's not so bleak, because what we have above us is the social layer. When we enter into a social dynamic with our fellow humans in a society, we are making a contract with them, and I believe that responsibility arises out of the deal, the rule we have with other people. It doesn't come out of brains. So the old view is that A produces B, produces C, and that's all there is to it, and there's sort of a dumb mechanistic view of that there's no free will and we're all zombies. And this is where I come back to Roger Sperry, who at an earlier papal conference made his point. We live in a deterministic world, yet brains is not a pawn to outside physical forces. And he goes on to say in this statement that's too dense to read, that just as molecules form in three-dimensional shape and haul around the lower atoms, so do the configurational properties of the mind have a causal role in the action of the nervous system. And this is all worked out in very strict terms and beliefs about a lot of things, and they're all complex topics. But he's making the point that there are levels of organization and they're important to think of. But what he doesn't really say in that analysis is where is responsibility. So this is where I come back to the point I'm making, that it's in the social layer, that we humans have put all kinds of stuff, we've uploaded it to the social layer, to the interactions we have with our fellow humans. And that is where I think responsibility is to be found. So brains are not free, people are free. It's the deal we have with another person that if they fail doing their job, we are going to hold responsible because that's the rules of a culture. And now we come to the notion of justice. And this is the implication. Here are these three horrible human beings who carried out terrible acts of violence in the United States and one in Norway. And the question is, what do we do with these people? How are we to think about them? So if you take this deterministic view, a lot of people take it at face value and they come up with interesting conclusions. One of them is that if you take a deterministic view and you're evaluating somebody in a prison, how long they're going to be in prison, what kind of punishment you're going to mete out to them, they take a more lenient view because they couldn't do it, they couldn't help themselves because things were determined. And if you bias them in another direction, that there is freedom of action, they kind of are harsher on them than normal. So the consequences of how people and what people think about this problem have tangible impact immediately on what and how people think about how to treat criminals, people violating the norms of a culture right away. So here is an example, a famous example from the history of neuropsychology, and it has to do with the patient Phineas Gage that had a railroad spike driven through his head. And it was the patient, an example of a case that produced a left frontal lobe lesion that is supposed to disinhibit one from their normal behavior, increase their violent streak, and therefore be what it's called a mitigating cause when you examine someone in the court setting. There's various problems with that, though. The problems start right away. There's a lot of people with this lesion who aren't violent, the rate of violence, it turns out, in the normal population is around 3 or 4%, and in people with left frontal lesion jumps to around 11%, I think is the last number I saw. It doesn't go to 100%. So to claim your patient might have a left frontal lesion and that's the reason they did what they did, really doesn't hold water on careful analysis. So what's happening is people are saying, well, what we're going to do is move to a more sophisticated analysis of brains. We're going to give them what's called a network analysis. And in that network analysis, we will no longer be talking about holes in the head in a particular place. We will have scientists supposedly showing up in courtroom that say, well, we've done a network analysis and their network is off. And they hope that that will have greater sway. That may be, it may not be, but that may be what's on the horizon. Another experiment run by the state of New Mexico first started a number of years ago by Kent Keel. The governor and the state bought an MRI scanner and placed it in a prison. And they basically started scanning all kinds of people, including psychopaths, severe psychopaths, sort of psychopaths, and people in between. And they were able to capture the fact that in the psychopaths there were disturbances as depicted there in the blue, in particular parts of the brain, doesn't matter where. Right now it's a particular pattern though. And so the notion is there are disorders like psychopathy that are related to specific parts of the brain. And as he has gone on to show, they're there in the adolescent brain, they're there in female brains, they're there. And the reason, and no one questions this, by the way, that that's the case, but the possibility is then they know where the disorder is. Are there going to be treatments on the horizon that would ameliorate this? Could the psychopath that hurts somebody be fixed? And would the family that had the person hurt be satisfied that the patient isn't going to be punished, they're going to be healed? Is that an acceptable social view, given the fact that we're all apparently very retributive at our core? So this information as in a study shows that it does have an impact on the judge's thinking and how he sentences. So finally, can we prevent future violence with all these methods? And it's an interesting question because, as you can see, the recidivism rate, the rate with which people punished come back and commit another crime, is this funny 63, 64%. So no matter what you do, there's a list of the various crimes there. You put them in jail, 63, 64% of them will be back, even though they've had their punishment. So does this punishment work? And the answer is clearly it has a lot of problems. And why does it work? Why doesn't it work? Well, there's new research that there's great differences in the effect of reward and punishment on rats versus human. There's something unique about humans, which is the appreciation of future punishment or reward. And the appreciation of future punishments and reward are in a particular part of the brain that seems to be dysfunctional or impaired in these psychopaths who continue to hurt. So, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, there are hopeful signs, and I'll finish with this one, which is take the juvenile brain and take impulsive behavior. Can anything be done to intervene? Can anything be done to detect impulsivity and know whether the intervention should be possible? And a study came out a few years back, 2 or 3 years, very recent, about studying teenagers with this impulsivity and examining what part of their brain might be hyperactive. And I guess I'll just leave it that there is a story there. And there's an intervention that seems to work. So one of the things where neuroscience may be involved in this whole question of social justice, this whole question of who did it and how are we going to treat people after they did it, may be that it'll help us generate interventions that will help in the corrective healing process. And then that begs the questions, well, will that satisfy people who were injured? So here we are, personally responsible, yes. What do you do about it? Do we punish? Do we treat and forgive? Do we sequester? These are our decisions, yours, mine, and everybody else, and we have to start thinking about them. So thank you very much.
When I was preparing for this interview, I saw a TED Talk by Dr. Daniel Amen, who is a clinical neurologist. Dr. Amen met a child who was causing problems with aggressive behavior, and this child was drawing pictures of himself shooting other children. And Dr. Amen, being a clinical neurologist, took a brain scan of this child, and he found a big cyst in the child's left frontal lobe. So after removal of the cyst, the child became normal again. In this case, can we say that this child did not have free will to control his aggressive behavior before the surgery?
So again, I would say that this child's mechanistic system had a disorder. The disorder was the cyst. It perturbed the system to behave in a particular way. And that is a very special case. It represents probably less than 0.5% of all the issues that one has to worry about on the question of who's responsible or not. So there are going to be special cases that are simply only to be dealt with by a further stance on how you deal with the exceptions. But I don't think it in any way disrupts the notion that responsibility is in the social layer, and then there's 99% of us are working on this mechanistic level when everything is normally functioning.
So we are allowing room for certain exceptions.
Oh yeah, oh sure. Yeah, it's the human condition. Everything's an exception. I mean, no, everything shouldn't be an exception. There are exceptions though.
So more generally, so how should we draw the line between who is clinically abnormal and therefore is not responsible for their actions and who is? Do you think that's a question remaining for science to answer? And do you think it's even possible for scientists to figure that out?
Well, never underestimate what scientists can figure out. all I'm saying is the special case category is over here, and one could be interested in seeing who gets into that category or not get into that category. I'm just saying it's a very small number of people relative to the general population, and the law is built on the norms of the general population. It's not built on the exceptions.
For me, I think the most difficult part of your talk is when you said that free will and responsibility emerges at the level of social interaction. I'm still having a hard time trying to understand that completely. And it seems that even social interactions and responsibility is something that relates to an individual's capacity and cannot be independent of one's brain activity. So perhaps social interaction is just another form of information to the brain or experience of the brain. And responsible behavior is the brain's response to it. Can you help me further understand your point?
So you started off by saying, I said free will and responsibility are on a social layer. I have put aside that free will is just a bad idea. It doesn't mean anything. So let's talk about personal responsibility. That's how I would respond. And it's a rule. It's a rule of joining the social group. One way of thinking about it is, if you were the only person on a desert island, the concept of personal responsibility is meaningless. There's no one to be responsible to. It only occurs, the whole concept arises out of being in a social group. And the demands of that social group is you have to respond in an appropriate way to your fellow members. So responsibility is a social concept in a social group setting only. So it's the layer above us. There's the body level, there's the mental level, and then there's the social level. And the social level is where responsibility is to be determined. It's not in the brain. It's in the rule to be a member of the social group. I think that's what I'm arguing anyway.
인간의 수많은 부위나 장기들 중에서 인간의 결정을 선택하는 다른 장기나 아니면 부위가 있을까요? 아니면 인간은 뇌의 숙주인 건가요?
So, you've got a brain, I've got a brain. And what does this brain do? The brain, from the get-go, from birth, comes with lots. The factory brings, this is a loaded car, right? And you ask it a question, and it comes up, it makes its best judgment about how to answer whatever question you have or whatever decision to make. And then it does it. And if it does it, and the minute it does it, of course that interpreter's right there and says, yeah, I did that, yeah, you bet, that's what we're gonna do here. So I just don't see there's a natural resistance to think that when we work out the mechanisms of the brain, it's just gonna be catastrophically depressing. I don't think so. I think it's great.